The lives of common men are soon forgot, their deeds lie buried in obscurity. So wrote my father in 1938.
This video is the story of one man. You won't read much about this man in the history books. He wasn't a famous politician, a general, a member of the royal family. He didn't invent anything famous. He wasn't involved with art, literature, or any other great fields of creativity. To me, this man is as important as any of those supposedly great and good people. And that man was Stephen Broom, and he lies here. Stephen Broom was my great-great-great-grandfather, and from an extremely inauspicious start in life, he managed to climb his way from poverty through to respectability. In this video, I'm going to relay the life of Stephen Broom, but I'm also going to pose some questions which I'm hoping you, the viewers, may be able to help me answer. Now, most people's story begins with relaying their date and their place of birth and who their parents were. But in Stephen Broom's case, I'm not able to do that, and we'll see why in a minute. I believe he was born in Norwich, about 15 miles from here, and I believe the year was 1786 or 1787. I know that from various census returns that Stephen filled in.
However, the first time Stephen appears in the public record is in the year 1797.
I'll read you what that record says.
It's found in the court minute book of the Norwich Incorporation of the Guardians of the Poor. Ordered that Stephen Broom of St. Peter Permountergate, aged 9 years and upwards, be bound apprentice to George Homestead of East Dereham, Norfolk, chimney sweeper, to be allowed 40 shillings with the usual clothing by special order of this court. So what we have here are the Norwich Guardians of the Poor seeking to get children for whom they were responsible off their hands. I've actually gone through the book and I'm compiling a record of all the young boys and girls apprenticed out, many as worsted weavers, you can see, cordwainer, but also chimney sweeps like Stephen. It's quite possible Stephen was housed in one of the large workhouses in Norwich. We actually have a report from the year that Stephen was apprenticed out, about 40 beds with straw in each room, a very poor diet, and the apprentices, the boys especially, being put to work in a spinning school, so he did learn a trade. However, despite several years of searching, many visits to the Norfolk Record Office, searches online, I've not been able to find any reference to a baptism or birth for Stephen, even when he remarried in 1851. And there was a space on the marriage certificate for him to name father and occupation of father. It was left blank, so I just assume he didn't know. So if anyone has any further suggestions of leads I could follow up to try and find who Stephen Broom's parents were, please let me know.
So there we have it, 9 years old, apprenticed to a chimney sweep. So this is the 1790s, and the use of young boys as chimney sweeps had grown very common in the UK. The boys were small, they were able to get into awkward, obscure bits of chimneys in order to clean out the soot, but it was a very dangerous and unpleasant occupation. So imagine young Stephen, we don't know who his parents are, he probably doesn't know who his parents are. Here he's come, 15 miles from the only place he knows, and he's being assigned to climb up and clean chimneys.
This drone footage I took basically covers every known location I have where Stephen lived and where Stephen worked. And it includes the churchyard in which he's buried. Our first location is along this lane by the church.
Right behind us at Washbridge Cottages in Dereham, just yards from the church. I have seen tax returns from the 1810s and 1820s which tells us that Stephen was living here. So after he'd served his apprenticeship, got past the age of 21, married Susan Walker, we know for the next few years he was living right behind me in Washbridge Cottages.
We then went into St Nicholas Church to see what we could find and got permission from a member of the clergy to film.
10th of October 1810, a significant event occurred in Stephen's life. At this very altar, he married Susan Walker. Susan was from Watton, about 10 miles down the road, and was 3 or 4 years older than Stephen. And at the opposite end of the church, we have further significant events in Stephen's life. His children were baptised in this very font.
We can see 7 children. The first 5 survived into late adulthood. Young Stephen unfortunately died in infancy. We'll hear more about Matilda in a little while. We can also see Stephen's occupations and how he changed to being a publican at some point in the mid-1820s. Those occupations taken from the baptism records.
So in 1799, just yards from where Stephen was living, an event occurred which has gone down in Dereham folklore, and it's centred on the bell tower of the church.
A group of French prisoners of war were being held overnight in the bell tower. A young officer by the name of Jean Denard escaped. Members of the East Norfolk militia searched the churchyard and the surrounding area just yards from where young Stephen was living. Denard was spotted hiding in a tree and he was shot and killed. In general, the people of Dereham were upset about this, and eventually a gravestone was erected in the churchyard, actually just 3 years before Stephen himself was buried, a few yards away.
So I'm now walking down Quebec Street. This was known as Back Street in the 1830s and 1840s, and it was here that an unimaginable tragedy struck Stephen Broom and his family, and that involved his youngest daughter, Matilda.
So a cold February day. It says in the newspaper report Matilda was about 6, she was actually 11. She was sitting by the fire, a burning coal fell upon her clothes, which were instantly in a blaze. She ran into the street, where she was rolled in the snow, but not before she was so dreadfully burned that death terminated her sufferings on the following day. Matilda is buried in the grave right next to Stephen's, alongside her mother, Susan. We have the 1841 census here, which shows Stephen and Susan living together in Back Street with 2 of their daughters and also employing 2 young men as chimney sweeps.
1851, Malthouse Yard, which I believe was just behind me, and we're only about 30 yards from where Stephen is buried. I have him living here with the following household.
Stephen's wife Susan had died in 1845, so he's living here with one of his daughters, Susan, and her family, also employing 1 chimney sweep. There had been a period in the 1840s where he was listed as a gardener and also somebody from whom you could hire a horse and gig. And by 1861 he's remarried another lady called Susan. He's also employing 2 chimney sweeps, including a boy apprentice, a practice that was allowed until the 1870s. That residence was located in Potter's Yard, that was somewhere along Dereham's Church Street, but I have not yet been able to locate a precise point for Potter's Yard. So I have all the significant events in Stephen's life taking place along Church Street or Back Street from the 1830s onwards. I therefore feel a deep sense of connectedness to this area every time I visit and pay my respects at Stephen's grave and that of his wife Susan and his daughter Matilda. I found a couple of references to Stephen in the contemporary newspapers, this one where he had a pair of shoes stolen in 1831. And this one from 1838 where he had a hoe and a brush stolen, so that speaks of him being a gardener at this time with his hoe and brush. The thief seems just to have escaped being transported to Australia.
Stephen would have been living in Dereham at the time that this windmill was constructed in 1836.
At that time Stephen was listed as licensee of the Half Moon pub, which was the building here on the right I believe. 2 of his sons also ran pubs in the town.
Stephen Broom would have seen the building of the engineering works behind me for the J.W. Gidney firm, who took full advantage of the coming of the railways to Dereham to build up their engineering business, which became famous around the country.
Yes, the railway network had reached Dereham in 1847. I wonder if Stephen ever used the railway for business or pleasure.
We're now in Dereham Cemetery, and there are several of Stephen Broom's descendants buried within these grounds. Now, descendants of Stephen Broom, I've managed to trace several hundred of them, and they engaged with all sorts of professions relative to their time. I have tailors, I have cinema entrepreneurs and proprietors, I have, coming up to the modern day, digital creators, professional musicians. People of all ranks and professions came from Stephen Broom and Susan Walker. But as well as people whose lives relatively prospered, sadly I found quite a number of suicides in Stephen Broom's descendants. I also found people who served and sadly were killed in both World Wars, and people who served time as prisoners of war too. One man in the hellholes of the Japanese prisoner of war camps. But we're heading now to find the grave of how Stephen Broom is connected to me via his second son, William. And here we have the grave of Stephen's second son, William Broom, my great-great-grandfather, who died in 1885. The inscription says his end was peace. I do wonder what came before that peace looked like. And right next to William's grave, we have that of Mary Ann Broom, who became Mary Ann Anderson, William's youngest surviving child, born 1820, who died in 1891. So Stephen had his fair share of woes that befell many people in the 19th century. He was a victim of petty crime. He had one child die in infancy and another one die a horrible death due to burns. His wife predeceased him after what the newspapers reported to be a lingering illness. But despite all those travails, despite his inauspicious start in life, and despite the potentially dangerous occupation of chimney sweeping, in which he engaged from being a young boy right up to the end of his life, he lived to the relatively grand old age of 74. So we tend to think of the lives of Victorian apprentice chimney sweeps as being ones of squalor and horror. But in this instance, I just want to pause a while. Yes, it was a horrible start in life, probably not knowing his parents and being apprenticed out to a chimney sweep who he didn't know, in a town he didn't know. But over the years, he became a master sweep himself. He was able to afford a gravestone when he was buried, and he fathered several children, great-grandchildren, and I managed to trace hundreds of Stephen's descendants scattered throughout the world, as well as the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. And all of us owe that man a debt of gratitude for struggling through those early years of his life and making what he became of himself, a respectable person in Dereham, working hard in all those different occupations and leaving a legacy that is still with us today.
So if you can suggest any further leads I might be able to follow up in finding out who Stephen's parents were, then please let me know, please get in touch. Also, if you think you might be descended from Stephen Broom too, then I'd love to hear from you so I can add you to my database of Stephen Broom descendants. And if you found this video interesting in any way and would like to see more of our history content, then please subscribe to the channel. It's absolutely free and we'll look at history from a range of different centuries and many different genres. So we hope you can join us next time, where every journey begins with a path to the past.